Future Warrior, Dawn of the Deimos. Chapter 17. Admiral Yoshiro Matsuda stepped briskly off the Swift-Foot's landing ramp, pausing only briefly to acknowledge the honor guard, the two rows of assembled Marine and naval personnel snapping to attention. Admiral of the fleet arriving, attention. Matsuda stopped in front of a naval lieutenant. You may dismiss your detail, Lieutenant. I'm sure they have more pressing duties. Take me to the High Admiral. On the trip across the vast facility, using the base's high-speed 2 train network, Matsuda took a few moments to take in the base itself. UEF Lunar was immense, the base's facilities stretching across the lunar surface and deep beneath it, its designers incorporating many of the lessons learnt in the construction of UEDF Command on Iceland. Utilizing several massive craters into its design, the base included heavy dry dock berths that could service and build even the largest ships used by the fleet. The choice to build the largest docks on the moon's surface rather than constructing space-based facilities had been primarily an economic decision, the cost of space construction being considerably higher than that on the moon. It was also made feasible by the moon's low gravity, which produced far less strain on ships' hulls than Earth-based docks, and made the construction processes and launching of the vessels that much easier. As the speeding train descended below the surface, the overhead view of the stars was replaced by bright lights that flashed by at regular intervals, producing an almost hypnotic effect. The train stopped at a secure station, a combination of heavily armed guards, automated defenses, and reinforced blast doors, stopping any unwanted visitor long before they would ever breach the inner reaches. Admiral Matsuda, however, passed through the various security checkpoints without a hint of irritation that might have affected the less patient. He knew full well that there were good reasons for the precautions. The news of Red Legion activities on Earth and continuing acts of sabotage and mutiny being well known by the senior officers and commanders of the UEF. After finally penetrating the base's outer layers, Matsuda reached the inner sanctum and he stepped out onto the navy blue carpet of the base's operations center. The main operations center of UEF Lunar was a single large room filled with row upon row of integrated consoles, equipped with comfortable chairs. The operators manning them surrounded by abundant, brightly lit holographic displays that showed everything from the armada of warships and orbital facilities that was currently in orbit above the heavily fortified installation to star charts of the most distant reaches of known space. Despite its seemingly chaotic appearance to the untrained eye, the command center was in reality a picture of carefully calculated organization. Representing the eyes, ears, and collective nerve center of an organization whose responsibilities stretched across the stars, the consoles, and their highly trained operators were divided up into a network of operational sections that covered the various regions, fleets, and branches of United Earth Fleet's command. At the center of the interconnected network of sections was the Facilities Correlation Center, the operational heart of the UEF's operations, and at that heart was the man that Matsuda had come to see, High Admiral Louis Francois Tourville. Admiral Matsuda presented himself to his commanding officer and saluted smartly. The man before him stood slightly taller than him, and despite holding the rank of Supreme Commander of the United Earth Fleet, his crisp uniform was surprisingly plain and lacked the copious medals and awards that Matsuda knew he earned during his career. His hair was longer than regulation for serving male officers and came down to the middle of his neck, and ended in untidy curls that showed its dark color. The near black paired with cobalt blue eyes set in a thin but handsome face. On his head at a slight angle rested a worn and slightly crumpled naval officer's cap that Matsuda knew predated the current issue naval uniforms by over 100 years and was an heirloom of Tourville's family. In all, at a passing glance, someone unfamiliar with Admiral Tourville might have thought him little more than a freighter captain who kept his naval blues out of sentiment rather than position. Matsuda, however, knew the man well and saw straight past the outward appearance. Tourville's eyes were clear and bright, and his casual stance and mannerisms hid a man whose knowledge of naval warfare and space tactics were unrivaled by any man or woman in the fleet. Descending from a noble as well as naval family with origins in the south of France, Tourville, a slight eccentric, had risen by virtue of ability, though the ranks steadily, since gaining his commission nearly 4 decades ago. His talents being recognized and rewarded in spite of character peculiarities that had won him as many enemies as it had friends. With an offhand gesture, Tourville returned the salute. A pleasant surprise. What brings you here, Yoshi? Yoshiro Matsuda didn't even notice the use of his nickname by his commander, the man having referred to him by the name since they first met at the UEF Naval Warfare College some years earlier. You requested my presence, sir. Did I? Oh yes, that's right, I did. Good of you to make it. Tell me, did you happen to see the buzzard in orbit on your flight to the surface? Yes, sir, I believe so. Tourville gave a slight, thoughtful nod at the news. I just got off the Hornder, Captain. They were boarded during the last action, had to vent 3 whole decks to clear the vermin out, lost over 200 crew and Marines. Did you ever happen to meet a Lieutenant Destré? Matsuda searched his memory for a moment, but could not recall having heard the name before. Can't say, I have, sir. Tourville shuffled his feet slightly and turned to look out over the bustling console operators. He is a son of a friend. I know his father in Bordeaux. Good family. Good taste in both cheese and wine, which is quite rare these days. He was so proud when his son got a commission in the fleet, wanted him to see the galaxy and broaden his horizons. He was a simple boy, but brave and loyal, almost to a fault. He's dead now, lost on the buzzard. The good captain was kind enough to let me know personally. I'm sorry to hear that, sir. Tourville smiled in his usual distracted manner, as if he was sharing a private joke over a glass of cognac by a warm fire rather than discussing matters of life and death in a high-tech command center in the middle of the most perilous war Earth had ever seen. Please, save the sir for someone who appreciates such things. I once had a tutor who insisted on me calling him sir. Put me off the word for life. Yes, Admiral. A naval intelligence officer passed a digital pad to Tourville, who had practiced e-scan through its contents before returning the pad to the waiting officer. Excellent. Implement recommendations A through J, but drop C. It's not necessary. And keep them coming, Carl. The officer saluted and hurried away. Tourville noted Matsuda's curiosity. 15 minutely progress reports on the fleet replenishment. Keeps them busy, you know. Matsuda waited, knowing that when he was ready, Tourville would tell him the reason for his visit. Well, I suppose you want to know why you're here. You served under Admiral Lev, did you not? Yes, Admiral. He was a great man. Indeed, he was. I confess we never truly got along, but despite our differences, we both respected each other as professionals in our own way. He even beat me once during war games in the academy, the only time I can ever recall being so outsmarted by an opponent. Are you aware of the nature of his demise? Matsuda shifted slightly. Not exactly, Admiral. He ordered us to execute a light-speed jump out of the system while he stayed behind to hold off the enemy. Once we jumped in a light speed, our sensors lost track of the Africa. Tourville nodded knowingly and stroked the light coat of stubble that covered his chin. When he resumed speaking, Matsuda noticed a change in his voice. It became more businesslike and focused, the casual note that occupied it until now suddenly disappearing as the voice of a naval professional took over. Well, what we now know is that he executed a ramming attack into an enemy ship. In short, he did the unthinkable, but in doing so, he made the unthinkable thinkable. Matsuda felt more confused than ever, but Tourville plowed on, seeming not to notice. Assembling on the edge of the system is a fleet of light-speed, capable merchant ships that we have quietly moved into position. I want you and the Aquarius to execute a light-speed jump into the heart of the main enemy fleet and then remain there long enough to guide the merchant ships into collision courses with the largest enemy vessels. It will require timing and perfect navigational skills. How's your NSO? Matsuda was lost for words as the audacity of the plan and the risks involved crashed down on him, and he had to pause to formulate his reply. Tourville waited patiently as he saw the younger admiral struggle for a moment with a mass of questions that were simultaneously welling up in his mind. After a moment, Matsuda decided on his response, the words coming fast and clear. My NSO is fine, Admiral, one of the best I have ever seen. What are the merchant ship's crews? how will they be evacuated prior to impact? The merchant ships will be unmanned and set on a one-way journey. Timing will be everything. Once they enter light speed, we won't have time to adjust their courses, so your NSO's plots must be correct. The accuracy of your calculations will be vital, as we will only have one chance to get this right. Once you jump into the enemy fleet, we will blanket the system with jamming to limit the Deimos vessel's sensors, so they won't have time to avoid the incoming vessels. This will also leave you blind, so make sure you have your escape vector set before you signal the fleet. Excuse me, Admiral, but if you're jamming the system, how will we signal the merchant ships? A rare serious expression crossed Louis-Francois Tourville's face. We will leave one frequency open for your signal. This is where speed will come into play. The Deimos will almost certainly find a frequency and use it to breach our jamming and see the trap we have set. You must get in, send the signal, and get out before they find it. Stalker guessed that about 40 tense minutes had passed since the battered defenders had streamed back from the lost third line and into the fourth. The fourth line was less than 3 kilometers from the River Rhine itself and skirted the edge of the city's central business district, CBD, with its towering commercial and apartment buildings. On the edge of the CBD itself was a narrow strip of parkland that stretched along a small stream that had once been a natural tributary of the Rhine, but after centuries of habitation and urbanization acted as part of the city's drainage network to help channel away stormwater. Using the high-rise buildings of the CBD for overwatch and the park as a buffer zone to withdraw through if necessary. The bulk of the defenders dug in opposite the park and city center in a line that ran through the University of Mainz and the city's main hospital complex before continuing northwest and southeast along the line of the city's rail network, where it emerged from underneath the CBD. The defenders had also been further reinforced as more of the Terra Nova's companies had begun to arrive from Wolfstein. Each passing minute brought more and more black armored infantry, and they hadn't come alone. With them arrived several RDR battalions that had been released from their static roles in quiet areas north of the city to reinforce the front line. Stalker also saw numerous ad hoc militia and reserve groups filtering into the front in a slow but constant stream, civilians with barely any weapons training and no combat experience arriving to defend their city, their homes, and their world. Stalker found his hatred of the Deimos growing as he took in the sight of the city and buildings around him. The once fine buildings, many of them centuries old, had been largely reduced to rubble, their skeletal ramparts standing out harshly against a mournful sky. In the now abandoned suburbs, fires burned unchecked, while amongst the desolation occasional pops and bangs could be heard echoing through the haze-filled air, the wind's fresh coolness replaced by an acrid heat that seemed to permeate everything it touched. The city itself felt like it was changing into something less than human, as if the taint of the Deimos was somehow converting the very bricks and mortar in an inhuman way. The defensive line was thick, and everywhere Stalker looked he saw armored vehicles positioned to deliver their deadly ordnance, while every pile of rubble, rampart, or structure seemed to hold dozens of soldiers, their weapons bristling in concentrated thickets. Strangely, Stalker found that the scene calmed his burgeoning anger, and he felt the burning rage subside within him. All around him were men and women hailing from all over Earth and coming from various branches of the UEA. Stalker could see the woodland, camouflaged SBA, uniformed platoons of cavalry troopers mixed in with the different patterns of SBA worn by the RDRs and local militia units. Scattered around them in tight knots were groups of USOC commandos looking formidable in their modified scout, sniper, EEA, and distinctive splintered urban warfare camouflage. First and foremost, however, Stalker recognized the familiar profiles of Terra Nova. Looking larger than life in their skull relief helmets and bulky EA, the veterans of his own 21st Company mixed in with others from the 3rd and 4th Terra Nova, who hard now arrived to bring death to all. Stalker cast a glance to his right and caught himself as he realized that Link wasn't there, having been withdrawn back across the Rhine with the other wounded. The glance was seen by the CIO, who gave a flick of his hand in gesture of a firing pistol, seemingly as cool and calm as ever. Nothing seemed to faze the young company intelligence officer Stalker hadn't noticed. A crackling message came through on the TACnet as the forward scouts reported movement. The Deimos were coming. Abruptly, Stalker heard the clear, commanding voice of General Sukbitar come through the broadcast system on several of the nearby entrenched Ironhide IFVs. In the terse silence, the voice carried clearly to the surrounding defenders, so that even those without the advantages of an EEA suit's acoustic system could hear the words clearly. The men and women tuning into the sound, which seemed to permeate everything as it echoed around the ruined buildings. Soldiers of Earth, the moment of your ultimate responsibility has arrived. The time has arrived to become heroes. An implacable enemy comes to our planet armed to the teeth, offering only death and destruction to our homes, our loved ones, our very race. What more can we ask for? Where can more glory or honor be found than here at this moment? Even if hell itself comes crashing to Earth, stand fast. Stand your ground and hold your lines. It is here, and it is now that we can stop them. In the words of our USOC brothers and sisters, let us have victory or death. Victory or death. Hoarse calls of victory or death rang out amongst the shattered rubble from thousands of voices, a call of defiance from an army that was unbroken. Stalker and the other Terra Nova joined them, calling out the motto of the United Earth Special Operations Command to the heavens, daring the enemy to come and silence them. The chief technician felt the piercing gaze of the man's cool gray eyes upon him, but did not meet them. His focus fixed entirely on the delicate task at hand, the pair of towering armored warriors behind the man, adding to his presence. How long until the weapon is ready for deployment? The technician frowned and kept working before glancing over at one of the other techs who responded to the unspoken query. Retrofitting the missile's warheads hasn't proven to be overly difficult, sir. The modification of the standard fuel-air warhead to take the new lighter payload is nearly complete in all 6 missiles. True to his word, a few minutes later the last of the modified warheads was lowered into the sleek shape of a stealthy surface-to-surface missile, or SSM, the innocuous payload canister, a silver cylinder, unmarked except for a stenciled word that read biohazard. As the missiles were readied, an electronic technician ran a series of checks and protocols on the weapon's onboard systems, all systems coming back as within acceptable operating tolerances. The preliminary checks completed, he connected the guidance data chip to the terminal and began to upload the target coordinates and flight path data before running a second round of diagnostics to be certain that all 6 missiles were operating correctly. Then, with his role completed, he disconnected the physical terminal, rechecked that the missile's wireless terminal was connected, and began to seal the missile's access panels. 15 minutes later, the 6 missiles were wheeled out of the brightly lit laboratory on their transport trolleys by teams of soldiers, wearing plain gray overalls, and into a large elevator. The elevator traveled upwards several levels before it emerged into another brightly lit room, where the missiles were wheeled to a large slot in the wall. One after the other, the transport trolleys were raised vertical, so that the missiles stood upright, the bottom and top catches of the trolley's frame sliding into grooves in the wall with a metallic click. Once in position, the soldiers activated a wall-mounted control panel, and the missile was drawn into the slot in the wall by a mechanism and disappeared up a tube and out of sight. From there, the missiles traveled still higher before entering the 6-round rotary ready-use magazine of the Vertical Launch System, or VLS. From a room several levels below the VLS magazine, the man's hard steel gray eyes again were focused on the chief technician as he confirmed that the weapons were armed and ready to fire. Target coordinates are locked, the warheads are armed, and all 6 missiles are squawking correctly. All that is now required is your voice, code, and DNA confirmation as you requested, sir. The gray eyes flickered over the room and then back to the short, slightly ungainly-looking man in front of him. He reached out and took the device from the technician's hand and, placing the molded grip in his hand, brought it up to his mouth. Sierra 2, Unicorn 11, Straw Garden, deploy. There was a slight pinprick on his thumb as the device took a DNA reading, and a second later it beeped. The chief technician took the device and inserted it into a slot in the brightly lit control panel. Voice, code, and DNA confirmed deploy the weapons. Next to them, a gray uniformed soldier seated at a console flipped the safety cover off a turnkey switch in front of him and turned the key. On the surface, icy winds moaned through the stands of tall trees, the wind dislodging small particles of snow from the thick layers that coated the branches and clumps pine needles. Nothing stirred, not a bird or insect. The region's animal inhabitants long since driven to hibernate or leave the icy landscape to escape the worst of the winter. Only the tough conifer trees remained to face the cold in lonely vigil. The gaunt quiet and illusion of solitude was, however, about to be shattered. There was no warning of what was to come, no visible outward sign of the subterranean activity that could identify the area as different from any other in the surrounding thousands of square kilometers of icy forest. There was an abrupt hiss of compressed air, and from under the snow, a long, sleek shape suddenly jumped skyward, clearing the height of the trees that surrounded the object's point of origin. Then there was a bright flash as the missile's scramjet engine ignited with a roar that echoed through the trees and across the silent ice-bound forest. The missile tore skyward with blistering speed, leaving a trail of vapor behind it in the frigid air. A second later, another hiss heralded the cold launch of a second missile, which blazed away, chasing the first. The cold launch system ensuring that the concealed launch tube and magazine weren't damaged by the missile's hot exhaust gases. One after the other, the missiles launched until all six were away, the echoes of their passage joined by a distant rumble as the missiles broke the sound barrier on their way to reaching 10 times the speed of sound. From the underground command center, General Jacob de Veers watched the missile's telemetry data as they climbed and began their one-way journey towards southern Germany. The selection of the City of Mines for the weapons test had been the obvious choice. The sector was the most imperiled of all the Deimos landing sites, and the dense urban terrain would offer the best real-world conditions to access the effectiveness of the weapon. He also knew he was fortunate to have it at all. Never had he conceived that the Deimos would somehow stumble across the deep space research facility. The prompt return of the program data had been crucial to reaching this point, and there was overwhelmingly one man to thank for that success. De Veers spoke without turning from the tracking display, confident in the knowledge that the man who served as his aide and bodyguard was close. "You know, this day might not have come if I hadn't taken your advice. You pushed hard for your recommendation in choosing the retrieval team." Pierce felt a twinge of pride at the words of his commander, knowing the huge praise that even those simple words carried from a man who said little. "Thank you, sir. I pushed hard because I knew it to be the right decision. I fought alongside him on Mars, and it was an honor to do so. He doesn't know how to fail a mission. He was the perfect choice." De Veers nodded. "Yes, I remember. If memory serves me correctly, he is also the same man who you said we should keep a close eye on, is he not?" "That is correct, sir. He saw enough on Mars to warrant observation. I considered it prudent that we keep an eye on him as a person of interest to the branch." De Veers didn't reply, but was silently impressed with his aide's instinct. Secrecy would always have enemies, but it also needed allies, even if sometimes those allies didn't know it. The attack had been going on for 30 minutes, and was as bitter as Stalker could ever remember. Around him, the once grand buildings of Mainz University were shattered, and many of the upper levels were in flames. The Deimos had hit them with coordinated armor and infantry assaults as before, but unlike before, the lines had bent, but they had not broken. Every inch of rubble and every ruined building had been bitterly contested, and countless bodies and destroyed vehicles of both defenders and attackers provided stark evidence of the ferocity of the fighting. The arrival of the much-needed reinforcements had finally allowed Stalker to concentrate his company and gain a measure of command and control that had been all but impossible with them spread out. Stalker had seen his company gradually pushed back through the university by the ongoing attacks, but looking around, he saw his men still had plenty of fight left in them. Stalker and the men around him squeezed off bursts at the running figures of Deimos, as once again they tried to push forward using piles of rubble between the wrecked buildings as cover, while from the buildings themselves Deimos energy fire lashed the positions opposite. Stalker's blue impulse round struck some of the blocks of masonry and shattered them, shards of stone spraying as the blocks exploded. The Deimos dropped and returned fire. Red energy rifle fire punching small burn holes in the brick wall behind Stalker's head. A round hitting the shoulder of one of the men next to him, who cursed in annoyance as his aim was thrown off, saved from injury by his EEA's thick armor. One of the Deimos leapt up to fire a rocket, but never got the chance. A heavy 13.2 millimeters HESH round popping the creature's head like a ripe watermelon. Good hit. Scratch up one more for the commandos. You keep this up, you might even reach our score one day. We can only hope to reach such lofty levels of perfection, replied the commando sniper. Stalker laughed as more energy fire erupted, and he was forced to take cover as rounds snapped overhead with a sound resembling lightning. On the left, the fire grew more intense as the Deimos pushed forward in a determined effort to find a weak spot in the line. Stalker, however, was equally determined to ensure that they would not find one. Mike 2-1, this is Alpha 2-1 over. This is Mike 2-1. Send Mike, move up and reinforce India and Charlie on the left. All received Alpha, death to all out. Stalker saw the men of Mike 2-1 begin to move from their positions behind him. The unit representing the last of his reserves, the black armored soldiers running through a hail of fire, trusting in their EEA to stop any rounds directed at them. Their eagerness to get into action after 30 minutes sitting on the sidelines was evident in their haste as they ran on through the enemy fire with reckless abandon, keen to extract some revenge from the Deimos and repay them for the losses the Terra Nova had taken in the grinding battle for the city. More Deimos shells abruptly rained down on the front, the concentrated shells landing with a flash and thunderous roar. The shells had slammed into two of the long rectangle campus buildings on the left and tore them, and a 7th Armored Cavalry Ironhide parked between them to pieces, tossing the IFV onto its side. Black and woodland pattern camouflage bodies visible in the rubble from the aftermath. Cries of medic carried to Stalker just as he saw scores of Deimos spring up and charge, their guttural roars sending a shiver down the spine of the defenders as they struggled to respond to the sudden assault. The Deimos rushed the lines, ASBR and IW fire meeting their berserker charge. Stalker went to swing his rifle around to fire across the running Deimos, but was forced to swing back to the front as more Deimos pushed forward. Everywhere, there was a furious intensity of fire, so many projectiles filling the air that it seemed as if you could reach up and catch a handful with ease. Scores of Deimos were cut down as they charged, but they didn't slow or falter, the lines impacting with a crash that sounded clear across the battlefield. Stalker could only watch as the lines clashed, now unable to fire even if he wanted to for fear of hitting friendlies, as the two forces merged into one indistinguishable mass. The Deimos fought with blinding speed and utter ruthlessness, but were met by a combination of primeval fury and desperation. The destroyed buildings echoed with meaty thuds and the crack of metal on armor, and Stalker could see the defenders faltering under the onslaught. A piercing crack heralded the death of a Deimos as a sniper from his position in the remains of a second-story room loosed a shot into the struggling melee below. Then there was a shout of death to all. Stalker spun towards the sound and saw the men of Mike 2-1 emerge from behind a wrecked building on the left and charge the enemy, their rifles at their shoulders and firing carefully aimed rapid single shots. Charging with them were dozens of Regional Defense Reserve soldiers, their obsolete IW-25s brandishing fixed bayonets, the men and women yelling incoherently as they ran. The sudden, furious counterattack swung the pendulum back in the defenders' favor as the Deimos turned to face the new threat. The battling Terra Nova watched the sight in amazement. The brazen courage required to willfully charge an unworldly enemy like the Deimos was a trait expected within the veteran soldiers of the Ten. But they had not expected to it be mirrored in many other branches within the UEA, let alone ill-trained reservists who had always been figures of some ridicule within the regular forces. The new arrivals smashed into the Deimos in a wave, the smaller number of Terra Nova amongst them drawing their close combat weapons and going to work with skilled strokes and shots. The reservists fought wildly, swinging and firing their rifles at the Deimos, the tall aliens towering over them. The fighting was wild and chaotic. Blood and pieces of flesh coated the rubble and the bodies of the dead and dying alike. The Deimos had drawn their twin-bladed knives, and they twirled and spun as they dealt death, killing with blinding speed and ruthless malice. One by one, however, they were being cut down, overwhelmed by the frenzied attacks of the masked reservists, impaled by their bayonets, and finished off at point-blank range with pistol and blade. It was all over in a few furious minutes, and the last of the Deimos were cut down, their slender bodies crumpled and discarded amongst the rubble. Stalker was thankful to see groups of medics quickly arrive to begin treating and withdrawing the wounded. The Deimos fire had petered out with the failure of their latest attack, and in a now all-too-familiar pattern, the infantry broke contact, while further back Deimos artillery opened up sporadic fire in an effort to reduce the buildings and defenders still further. Stalker was busily reorganizing what was left of his command when a sudden comm, net communication, got his attention. Alpha 2-1, this is Iron Horse, over. Stalker could hear the urgency in the voice of the young CIO and activated his TACnet. Go for Alpha 2-1. Boss, we got trouble. I'm getting reports of mecha hitting the line further north. A USOC recon element has reported several machines inbound to your sector. All received, Iron Horse. Keep me informed. 2-1 out. Stalker was suddenly very glad that he had sent his CIO to the regimental CP to keep him appraised of the wider situation. The Deimos had finally committed their mecha to break the stubborn resistance. Starlight, this is Alpha 2-1, over. Go for Starlight. Doc, we have incoming mecha. I need those wounded out of here now. There was no reply, but Stalker saw the medics suddenly quicken their pace, the armored form of the CSO amongst them, dragging wounded men back towards the waiting Warthog ambulances. Stalker's mind raced as the news sank in. They had little time. Buccaneer front and center. A moment later, the burly frame of the company ordnance technician slid into the dust alongside Stalker. The COD was a vital member of the company command unit, in his late 40s and having a gruff manner to match his gruff appearance. The COD was a trained armorer and a master at both disarming and using explosives. Stalker couldn't think of a better man to help him bring down a mech. The defenders felt them approaching long before they saw them, the vibrations of the footfalls transmitting clearly through the ground, the seismic shocks causing small pieces of masonry to fall from the shattered buildings. Then they appeared. At first there were only glimpses, dark shapes moving between the distant buildings, more wraith than reality. As they approached, the first noises echoed on the dust and smoke-filled wind, the sound of crunching stone and a metallic clank that registered each stride. The commandos, with their enhanced sniper vision, were the first to get a good look at the enemy machines, the sight of them freezing their hearts in their chests mid-beat, even the elite soldiers not prepared for their first sight of a Deimos mech. 3 of the colossal machines advanced in a single column down the street, heading directly towards the ruins of the university. They were tall, each standing taller than a 3-story building. They were bipedal in design and advanced in slow, deliberate strides, glowing ion thrusters showing under their feet as they rose and fell. Their body and limbs were massively reinforced, giving them a bulbous, almost muscle-bound appearance, like a prize fighter or champion wrestler. Their joints and shoulders sported large spherical areas of reinforcing armor, adding to their bulky appearance. The machines colored head to foot in the same dirty, rusty color as that of the Deimos warships. As they got closer, more detail could be seen. Squat rocket pods adorned the shoulders. One arm sported an integrated flamethrower and a clawed hand, while the other was equipped with a massive arm-mounted shield of thick metal, the shield wide enough to cover a sizable portion of the mecha's body, the shield arm also ending in another fearsome clawed hand. To the defenders, their design and purpose could not have been more clear if it had been written upon them for all to see. They were heavy assault mecha, their weapons and design perfectly adapted to smash through heavy infantry defenses. Holding to Stalker's strict orders, the lines remained silent as the mecha approached. Looming between the buildings, the defending infantry frozen deathly still as they pressed themselves into the rubble and earth, willing themselves to remain hidden from the sight of the advancing mecha. The lead machine advanced close between two buildings as the second followed it and stepped in its place. The COT from his position near Stalker blew the charges. The carefully concealed C6 charges were set to their maximum yield, and the concentrated force of 4 of the yellow disc-shaped devices on one side blew the second machine's legs out from under it, the mech crashing to the ground with a ground-shaking impact. From the ruined landscape, hundreds of rifles and automatic weapons opened fire, the air filling with flashing lines of tracers. The small arms fire was joined by scores of missiles and anti-tank grenades, all the weaponry pouring into the lethal space between the buildings. The column of mecha reacted with speed that belied their size and bulk. The leading machine shrugged off the hail of fire directed at it and stormed forward, bringing the arm with the shield up in front of it as it crashed forward. As it moved past the buildings, several groups of reservists and cavalrymen in the buildings on each side opened fire at point-blank range, their slap anti-tank rockets smashing into the mech's flanks. Unperturbed, the mech simultaneously raised its arm-mounted flamethrower and incinerated one building, while a salvo of rockets launched from a shoulder pod slammed into the building opposite. The effect was devastating. One of the buildings was torn to pieces along with its defenders, while in the other the defenders were incinerated in a wall of flame, their pitiful screams carrying clearly to those still alive to hear them. Stalker pumped out a 50mm heat grenade from his M503, the round arcing upwards towards the thrashing lead mecha. Stalker realized it going to impact the massive arm-mounted shield, but it never reached it. With a flash, the grenade detonated just short of the shield in mid-flight, and as the mecha turned, Stalker could see that the surface of the shield shimmered like water. A missile blazed in, and as Stalker watched it too, exploded just short of the shield's surface as if struck by lightning. Sparks from small arms fire hitting the shimmering barrier covering the shield could also be seen, and Stalker cursed as it dawned on him. The shield was equipped with some type of energy-dampening shield, but unlike any he had ever seen, this one also stopped solid projectiles, not just energy weapons fire. With one mech seemingly down from the explosives, the remaining two went wild, the huge machines acting as if possessed by demons, smashing the already ruined remains of the buildings around them to dust and pouring out sheets of flame and salvos of lethal rockets at concentrations of defending infantry. Shrugging off the fire directed at it, the lead mech began striding forward, the ground shaking with its footfalls. As it moved, the shoulder-mounted rocket pods pivoted independently and fired at any targets that presented themselves, the high explosive rounds sowing death and destruction as they showered groups of defenders with shrapnel and flame. The mech seemed to grow impossibly large to Stalker as it approached, the machine itself seeming to exert a cold malice as it continued to tear apart the defenses. Stalker and the men around him poured heat grenades and rockets into the vulnerable parts of the mech, ignoring the vast shield and aiming for the limb joints and any visible optics. Like an elephant trying to squash a nest of ants, the mech stormed forward furiously, moving with a speed that belied its size and bulk. Displaced, Stalker jumped up and ran from rubble he had been using as cover just as the mech's huge foot came down, crushing a man who had been a second slower. The impact crushed the man to a bloody pulp in an instant, his remains ground down even further as the mech twisted and stepped again, this time sending a squad of reservists manning a heavy machine gun scattering, the group only making it a few meters before being caught in a wave of blue flame and incinerated, the burning men screaming as they melted like horrific human candles. From further back, an Ironhide IFE launched 2 corkscrew anti-tank missiles. Both flew true, but at the last moment were intercepted by the mech's active defenses and shot down, showering the heavily armored mech with harmless burning fragments of debris. As the mech turned to face this new threat, there was a sudden flash of blue and a rail shot struck the mech in what could only be described as its head, the structure being skewered by the shot like a giant white-hot needle. The mech shuddered like a wounded animal and was slow to react as a long stream of armor-piercing pulse rifle fire strafed it from the Ironhide, tearing off chunks of armor and leaving a trail of black scars across its chest. As its systems faltered its main sensor array destroyed, and with internal systems damaged from the pulse rifle fire, its automated defenses shut down. As they went offline, the torrent of fire directed at it from all directions began to tell as they got through and made clean hits. Over a kilometer away, the commander of the modified Prowler said a silent prayer as at last the railgun came back online, and the gunner acknowledged that he had a solution. The mech was behind buildings, but that was not a problem for the Prowler, or its new generation density sights, seeing through the brick and mortar to the much denser mech as if they were only the ghostly outlines of buildings. With a flash that blinded him for a brief instant, the gunner fired. The rail shot passed through the buildings as if they were made of paper and slammed into the mech's chest, penetrating deep into the crew compartment. The transferred kinetic energy liquefying the mech's crew in a fraction of a second as they fought to bring crucial systems back online. A ragged cheer echoed amongst the chaos as the mech staggered and then fell in one final ground-shaking crash. Stalker ran to the huge prone form the mech and stopped behind one of its huge legs. Further down the street, the third mech remained in action and was now surrounded by masses of advancing Deimos infantry, while behind it a column of Deimos vehicles had moved up in support. As Stalker began to fire at the Deimos infantry, the lead slider's missile turret abruptly rose out of the hull, and two missiles blasted skywards, the sleek weapons going vertical. Both missiles then sharply changed course and separated. One homed in on the iron hide, but was intercepted before it got there by the vehicle's active defenses. The other made a beeline for the Prowler, R, which unfortunately for its crew had been so rushed into production that there had not been time to integrate active defenses into the new railgun turret. The unimpeded missile sliced through the vehicle's frontal armor, decapitating the driver, before destroying the Prowler and killing the rest of the crew in a short, sharp explosion which landed the turret on the ground next to the burning hull. Stalker, however, had no idea of the fate of the Prowler as he and the men and women around him fought desperately to hold off the tide of infantry, which surged forward around the remaining mech. Spotlight, what's the word on my fire support, over? Stalker was forced to drop as a burst of red energy rifle fire scattered across the line from a ruined building on the left, one round skimming across his back, but being caught by the EEA's tough skin before it could cause any damage. Say again, Spotlight. I said I have a Mars strike online. Rain incoming in 06 minutes. Over. The battery commander of D Battery of the 77th Terra, Novamac, reached up and touched the side of the tube on the Mars. It was red hot and steamed in the cool air. His battery had been in constant action for hours and had delivered over a dozen strikes. The barrels needed time to cool. There was a risk that the missiles would cook off in the tubes. He knew, however, that he wasn't going to get that time. Each new fire mission that came in was more vital than the next. People were dying every minute he delayed. He glanced around at his men. Despite the icy breeze passing through the trees, they were drenched in sweat, every man and woman moving with purpose as they struggled to get the next strike ready. What they were doing was dangerous and contravened regulations, but he knew that if he gave them the choice to stop or continue, that not one of them would stop, not while Terra Nova was fighting and dying. Regardless of the risks, D Battery of the 77th Mac of the Terra Nova was staying in the fight. All tubes were loaded and final checks were being made before they could fire. Some procedures could not be overlooked. He watched as one by one the individual Amars began to flash up ready status. He turned and looked at the forest on the opposite side of the battery. Suddenly alert, something was nagging at his mind, scratching at his subconscious, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck suddenly stand up on end. He froze. He didn't know why, but something was wrong. Something was out of place or missing, but only silent, dark, tall trees met his eyes. He shook his head at his foolishness and was about to turn away when it hit him. It had been over 10 minutes since he had seen a patrol of sentries pass by. The sentries had been passing every 5 minutes like clockwork, and they were late. They were never late. He felt panic rise in him like a tide, and he spun to pick up the comm link to the company commander. But it was too late, and the tree line erupted with the flashes of plasma fire. The bursts of superheated plasma fire streaked across the empty space and slammed into the defenseless Amars. The vehicles nearest to the tree line were hit first, the plasma blasts burning through the thinly armored launch tubes and exploding the full loads of 18 volatile artillery rockets in cataclysmic explosions. Each exploding Mars was devastating, the fireballs like miniature suns, everything in a wide radius being incinerated. In desperation, the commander of D Battery hit the launch controls, and the rockets began to fire from the remaining Mars, a few getting airborne before those launchers were obliterated. It would be the last act of his command. As he grabbed his ASBR and spun to face the as yet unseen enemy, he felt a sudden, brutal, smashing impact across his midsection and was thrown 20 feet across the grassy clearing. The first sensation that burst through to his semi-conscious mind was of the taste of blood in his mouth, and in horror, he realized he had bitten his tongue nearly completely through. He rolled onto his back, his body numb, everything still silent as his traumatized body went into a primitive survival mode and shut down some of its senses as it struggled to deal with the shock of its injuries. He managed to prop himself up, trying to ignore the blood which was pouring from his mouth. It was then he saw the extent of his injuries. Everything below his waist was missing, the flesh torn and ripped. He stared dumbly at his ruined body, his brain unable to compute what it was seeing. Intestines hung out in a blood-slicked grayish mass, and at the bloody base amongst the red shreds, he could see the white bone of part of his pelvis protruding. Even as the true horror of his situation began to burn through to his shocked mind, his body began to shut down, unable to cope with the trauma and virtually total blood loss that it was suffering. He looked around groggily, his dreamy state turning into a nightmare as with a thud a Strider landed next to him. He stared wordlessly at the machine. The Strider seemed to crouch menacingly, like a lion about to pounce, only a small rotating radar on top of its low-profile body indicating it wasn't frozen in time. On one shoulder, a stubby plasma weapon adjusted and fired at some distant target, the fizz-hiss sound made by the weapon adding a strange element to the soundtrack of the chaotic explosions all around. At the Strider's sides were two massive hands sporting wickedly long metallic claws. He tried to speak, but his ruined mouth was filled with blood and only a gurgling sound came out. The Strider pivoted slightly, and for a second the dark canopy seemed to stare into him. Then with a blur of movement, one of the claws slashed out, and he saw only darkness. Stalker had lost count of the number of rounds he had fired. His ASBR felt heavy in his hands, and even through his gloved hands he could feel the heat radiating from the weapon. The Deimos had worked their way close to the defenders, and a fusillade of grenades were being exchanged across the ruined landscape. Through the haze, Stalker could see the massive shape of the remaining mechs striding through the carnage, smashing everything in its path, blue flame arching out in waves. Stalker raged. They had thrown everything at the remaining mech, but had failed to bring it down. Halting the rush of Deimos armor had used up the remainder of their anti-tank weaponry and cost them the last of the supporting armor, the smoke of vehicles visible rising on both sides. Alpha 2-1, strike inbound, combo warheads, over. Thank God. Alpha 2-1 to all units. Designate now. Target the mech. Stalker activated his ASBR's integrated laser designator and aimed at the distant mech. From several locations, other lasers lit up and aimed at the towering machine. The lasers invisible to the naked eye, but showing up clearly to the Terra Nova thanks to their EEA's visual enhancements. The seconds seemed to drag into eternity before almost unexpectedly the Mars rockets arrived. The combo warhead round was designed to be a general-purpose round and featured a tandem warhead. The rockets had a frontal armor-piercing warhead and then a secondary HE warhead, allowing them to penetrate reinforced bunkers or destroy troops in the open with equal effectiveness. 4 of the heavy rockets arrived at close to the speed of sound and, guided by the laser designators, smashed into the mech. The rockets impacted with a clap of thunder that lifted dust from the ground and blew out the eardrums of anyone unfortunate to be close enough and not wearing acoustic protection. The one was caught by the mech's defenses and exploded, while another struck the massive shield, which took the brunt of the explosive force. The final 2 scored direct hits on the mech's carapace, and smashed the machine to the ground. The kinetic force, combined with the explosive power of the 4-meter-long rockets, tore the mech's limbs off and slammed it into the ground with such force that its fusion reactor chamber was breached. In an instant, it went critical and exploded with apocalyptic force. Even at the distance he was from the mech, the stalker was knocked off his feet by the force of the explosion. Standing ruins in a wide radius were flattened, burying Deimos and UEDF alike, a mushroom cloud of dirty brown debris climbing skyward. Stalker picked himself up and took in the destruction he had wrought. The mech's crumpled form surrounded by scores of Deimos caught in the blast. Stalker glanced around. Without the need for orders, makeshift units were already pushing forward, keen to maximize their advantage as the explosion and shock of the mech's spectacular death took the heart out of the Deimos advance. From somewhere a voice yelled, "Charge!" The call was taken up all along the line, and the defenders surged forward, the black armored Terra Nova with them. Stalker decapitated a wounded Deimos with his sword as he ran past without breaking his stride, his empty ASPR slung. Next to him, reservists fired wildly as they ran, spraying the forms of staggering Deimos with largely inaccurate fire. What was left of the enemy attack faltered, and then died in an instant as the Deimos were hurled back by the fury and suddenness of the counterattack. What started as a local effort quickly turned into a general counterattack around the rubble of the once proud Mainz University precinct. Stalker saw that his men were pushing the attack to its limits, taking risks and pushing forward with unrelenting pressure as all along the line battle continued to rage amongst the ruined remains of the city. Even in his time on Mars, Stalker couldn't recall a battle with a pure ferocity. The volume of fire seemed to mesh into one chaotic wall of lethality, promising nothing but death to any who ventured into it. There was a bitterness present that Stalker had never known in the fighting. Even during the campaign on Mars, to most of the soldiers, the fighting had been just a job to be done professionally with honor. But here, against the Deimos in one of Earth's ancient cities, there was a bitterness and hatred so strong it seemed to flow like water washing over rock. The Deimos were pushed back and broke contact as they withdrew en route, the firing slowly dying out as the lines fell quiet. Only the crackling of flame, the crunching of rubble underfoot, and muffled cries of the pain breaking the silence.